Okay, the most excellent and lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, the most familiar of all Shakespeare's plays, and one to which audiences, even if they've never read it or seen it performed, bring all sorts of assumptions and expectations that have been absorbed vicariously through our popular culture, starting even when we're children, and these assumptions and expectations can shape our response to the play when we finally do encounter it for the first time. So it's important that we be conscious of them and understand where they come from. Talk a little bit about the history of the play. It was written and performed in 1595-96, around the same time as A Midsummer Night's Dream. The relatively high percentages of verse and rhymed lines in both plays is typical of Shakespeare's lyrical period, which also includes the plays The Comedy of Errors, Love's Labour's Lost, and Richard II. But Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream are more akin in their shared concern with romantic love. In both plays, there's a marriageable daughter who defies her father's choice of husband and is willing to leave behind family and community to be with her chosen lover. In Midsummer, it's Hermia who's in love with Lysander. As many readers have noted, the love story of Pyramus and Thisbe, the subject of the play that's clumsily performed by amateur actors at the conclusion of Midsummer, closely parallels and at the same time contrasts with the tragic denouement of Romeo and Juliet. There are parallels with other lyrical plays as well. In Love's Labour's Lost, for example, Shakespeare inserts a number of sonnets. These are highly stylized 14-line lyric poems on love-related topics, and he embeds them in dialogue between the characters. And we find several sonnets in Romeo and Juliet as well. The play's chorus, we'll talk about the chorus in a minute, appears twice, first in the prologue and then again to begin Act 2, and both times their speech conforms to the English sonnet structure. Another sonnet is embedded in Romeo's famous first exchange with Juliet at the Capulets masquerade in Act 1, Scene 4, and we'll take a closer look at that interaction a little later in this video. So I want to talk about the chorus and the sonnet a little more detail. These are important features of the play. We hear from the chorus first. The chorus is the earliest instance of Shakespeare's, well, Romeo and Juliet is the earliest instance of Shakespeare's use of a chorus. And it's a vestige of ancient Greco-Roman drama in the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. The chorus was spoken or chanted or sung by a group rather than by an individual actor. Its purpose was to provide exposition and commentary on the primary events of the play. And Shakespeare used the chorus this way as well, although he abandoned it in this play after the beginning of the second act. In Henry V, the last play of the first Henriade tetralogy, the chorus, he uses a chorus in that play as well, and the chorus introduces all five of the play's acts. As for the sonnet form is Italian originally. It was introduced to English readers in the early 16th century by poets like Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard. The most well-known Italian sonneteer was Francis Petrarch, who wrote hundreds of sonnets expressing his idealized love for a woman named Laura. In Shakespeare's play, in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio alludes to Petrarch by name in his ribbing ridicule of Romeo's love melancholy in Act 2, Scene 3, lines 36 to 38. By the end of the 16th century, most of the major English poets, including Shakespeare, had experimented with the sonnet form. It consists of 14 rhymed lines that can be organized either as an octave and sestet, that's the Italian form, or as 3 quatrains and a couplet. I have another video, a couple videos actually, on Renaissance sonneteers. If you want to learn more about the sonnet, you can go and look at those. The latter form, the 3 quatrain couplet form, known as the English sonnet, was Shakespeare's preference and is the form used in Romeo and Juliet. So here is the title page to the 1597 quarto. And this is the first one. It was published by John Danter. This is the same John Danter who had published Titus Andronicus in 1594, and that was the first of Shakespeare's plays to appear in print. The year 1597, the year of this play, was something of an interregnum year for Shakespeare's theater company. Their first patron, Henry Carey, who was Lord Chamberlain to the Queen, had died in 1596 and was succeeded in his office by William Brooke, the 10th Baron Cobham. This is the same William Brooke who would object to Falstaff's original name of as Oldcastle in the Henry IV plays. Carey's son, while Cobham was Lord Chamberlain, Carey's son, George, the 2nd Baron Huston, promptly took over his father's role in the company, which was therefore known briefly as Lord Hunsdon's men. When Brooke, the Lord Chamberlain, died a year later, George Carey assumed his father's former position, and the company reverted to its former title, the Lord Chamberlain's men. An airplane flying over my head here. So here is the title page to the second quarto, 1599. And it was published by Cuthbert Burby, who was actually a fairly close associate of John Danter. And John Danter may have informally transferred the printing rights to Burby. Burby had also published Love's Labour's Lost the year before this, in 1598. By this point, Hunsdon's men were performing once again as the Lord Chamberlain's men. The Globe Theatre also opened in this year in 1599, and Romeo and Juliet, already recognized as one of Shakespeare's most popular plays, may have been revived to attract audiences to the new theater. Danter's earlier edition is substantially shorter by several hundred lines than Burby's edition, and is sometimes identified as one of the bad quartos. Hamlet is another example of a play that has one of these bad quartos. Some textual scholars today prefer the less pejorative term short quarto. I was, when I was in school, my professors referred to them as bad quartos. That kind of stuck with me, but I understand the preference for the term short quarto. The second quarto claims to be corrected, augmented, and amended, and it is the base text for nearly all modern editions of the play today. So just to illustrate this, I'm going to give just a short example here. This is Mercutio's just fantastic Queen Mab speech. It's a speech about the origin of dreams, and it's one of those speeches which stands well on its own and can be read and enjoyed for its own sake, like a completely independent poem. The selection here is actually from the very end of the speech, which contains some of Mercutio's signature body wordplay. His speeches throughout Romeo and Juliet are just riddled with obscene innuendos and double entendres, some of them quite explicit. I chose this passage in particular to demonstrate how the process of transferring manuscript materials to print can alter a play's structure and meaning. In this example, this is from the first quarto. This is Danter's bad quarto. As you can see, and the quality of the text here is not very good, but the speech, you can tell, is written entirely in verse, though it would appear from the metrically irregular line that I'm pointing to there, that begins, "This is the very mab," that there may have been some uncertainty as to the passage's proper lineation. This line has 8 iambic feet, which is inconsistent with the passage's regular pentameter lines. Whatever the cause for the length of this line, the compositor set the end of it, the last metrical foot, at the end of the preceding line because it just wouldn't fit, and separated by a parenthesis. And this was not an uncommon printing house practice in this period. So because this is so hard to read, I'm going to put a transcription of it up there, including its lineation. And again, you can see that line. This is the very mab that plates the manes of horses in the night. I've got it at its full length there. So we'll put it down here and talk about the second quarto. So this is how the same speech appears in Creed's second quarto. In the second quarto, the speech has several additional lines, and there are numerous word changes that are generally regarded as improvements over the earlier version. And you'll see this more clearly when I place the first quarto and second quarto versions side by side. The most obvious difference, however, and you can see it even looking at it here, is that Creed set much of the speech as prose rather than verse. So here, the speech is actually printed across 2 pages. The recto of the second leaf of signature C, you can see the signature mark there at the bottom of the recto page, and then the speech continues to the top of the verso. And because the speech returns to verse for the last 4 lines on the verso page, textual scholars believe that the recto lines were set in prose to maximize page space, perhaps because the verso had already been set and or printed, and so the lines had to fit. They had to fit on the recto side. Whatever the reason, this version of the speech was consulted by Jaggard for the 1623 folio, which replicates the prose pattern. I'll show that to you in a minute. Here's a transcription of the speech, the end of the speech, as it's set by Creed, and I'll put it down here next to Danter's. And you can see, just looking at the first line, Danter's first line, "Sometimes she gallops over a soldier's nose," and Creed and Burby's edition, "Sometimes she driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and then dreams he of cutting foreign throats." So there's an example of a word change that I think makes it a better passage. I consider it an improvement. Here is the folio set, and like I said, you can see that clearly Jaggard went to the second quarto. He replicates the prose pattern exactly, including the switch back to verse for the last 4 lines. But modern editions of the play take the speech as it's printed in the second quarto and folio editions, but then take the liberty of restoring it to the verse lineation printed by Danter, and that's how it appears in the Norton edition. So we'll talk now about The characters, quite a few of them, but the major ones I want to talk about, obviously got to talk about Romeo. This photograph on the left in the Folger Library shows the actress Esme Beringer in the role of Romeo. She was known for her fencing skills, quite exceptional. She trained with Olympic fencers, and she was given many male parts at the time, late 19th, early 20th century, parts that required swordplay. She was so good. In this production from 1896, she played Romeo to her sister Vera's Juliet, which is interesting. Balthazar is Romeo's servant. He plays a pretty large role at the end of the play. And then his cousin Benvolio is another character whose name will come up quite frequently in our discussion of later scenes. And these three are, of course, Montagues. So then we have Juliet. There is the famous Shakespearean actress Julia Marlowe playing Juliet there. And she played opposite the actor E.H. Southern, whom she eventually married. They were married quite a long time before he died. And you'll see another picture of her in that role a little later. The character of the nurse, obviously very important. And Tybalt, hot-headed Tybalt. They are the Capulets. And then there are four other characters that I want you to know. Prince Aeschylus, who, like the character of Aeschylus in Measure for Measure, is a figure that embodies social order and dispassionate justice. Mercutio, this is a kinsman of Aeschylus and close friends with Romeo and Benvolio. In fact, Mercutio and Benvolio hardly ever appear separated. And then County Paris, this is the nobleman chosen by Juliet's father to be her husband. And then finally, Friar Lawrence, a neutral character who, like Aeschylus, works to make peace between the Montagues and Capulets, but in doing so finds himself way over his head. So as I sometimes do in these videos, I like to show an illustration from the play and let you all sort of guess what scene is being portrayed. If you'd like to pause and study this image and take a guess as to who these people are and what scene is portrayed here. It's Act 1, Scene 4, lines 186 to 217, a scene that we will talk about a little later. Not all these characters are easy to decipher. I'm obviously this is Romeo and Juliet and her nurse together. And I feel pretty confident that over here on the far right is Tybalt, the only person portrayed here with a rapier, and he looks pretty agitated. If this is Capulet, he looks a little too young to me, but I don't know who else that could be. So I'm assuming that is Capulet. And then I've got these two gentlemen here, Benvolio, and I think that character looks a little lecherous, so I'm going to call him Mercutio, although I'm not entirely sure of that. And again, we'll take a look at the scene a little later. So at this point, I'm going to summarize the play, just give a synopsis of each of the 5 acts, starting with Act 1. So the play is set in Verona, and a finger gesture escalates into a full-blown street fight between the Capulets and Montagues. Prince Aeschylus arrives, he restores peace, and proposes a conference to negotiate an end to this long-standing blood feud between the families. Afterward, Benvolio meets Romeo, who who suffers from the melancholy of unrequited love for a woman named Rosaline. Benvolio believes he can cure Romeo by introducing him into the company of other beautiful women. Later, Capulet encourages County Paris to woo his daughter Juliet and invites him to a masquerade at his villa. Benvolio learns of the party from Capulet's servant and sees here an opportunity to prove his love cure to Romeo. On the night at the masquerade, Juliet hears advice from her mother and nurse on Paris's marriage qualifications. Romeo and Benvolio, accompanied by their mutual friend Mercutio, arrive at the Capulet's villa. Romeo has had premonitions of disaster, but agrees to attend the party. His concerns, it's quite funny how quickly his concerns evaporate at the sight of Juliet. But Tybalt, a Capulet, is enraged to discover a Montague in their midst. He recognizes him by his voice, which is curious to me. Juliet also recognizes Romeo by his voice in Act 2. Wanting to maintain the truce brokered by Aeschylus, Juliet's father defends Romeo's reputation and casts Tybalt out of his house. Meanwhile, Romeo introduces himself to Juliet, who expresses a mutual attraction to him, though afterward each is distressed to learn that the other belongs to the rival house. So, Act 2, there's the famous balcony scene. This is a picture of Cyril Bellew and Eleanor Robson as Romeo and Juliet. This production was 1903. Love that image. So after the party, Romeo ditches his friends and retreats into Capulet's garden, where he overhears Juliet at her window attesting her love for him and bemoaning the obstacle of their family loyalties. Romeo reveals himself to her, and both proclaim their mutual love for one another before being interrupted by Juliet's nurse. The following morning, Romeo visits Friar Lawrence to ask for his aid in marrying Juliet. Though skeptical of Romeo's impulsiveness and fickle affections, remember just the day before, Romeo had been in sort of desperate straits over his unrequited love for Rosaline. But the friar consents to this proposal, believing it might close up the breach between the two families. Meanwhile, Benvolio and Mercutio discuss Tybalt's letter challenging Romeo to a duel. Romeo's appearance shifts the conversation to some obscene repartee. Juliet's nurse arrives next. Romeo apprises her of his intent to wed Juliet later that afternoon and devises a plan to access her bedroom that night so that they can consummate their marriage. She, the nurse, relays the plan to Juliet, who rushes to join Romeo at Friar Lawrence's cell, and they are hastily married. Act 3, another photographs from the same production as before. We have Mercutio dead there. Pivotal moment in the play. So Benvolio and Mercutio engage with a party of Capulets in the street. Never good. Romeo arrives, and Tybalt immediately challenges him to a duel. He's been looking for Romeo. But Mercutio is infuriated when Romeo declines the challenge, hinting at his marriage to a Capulet, although neither Tybalt nor Mercutio put it together. This situation escalates into a street fight, and Mercutio is slain. Distraught over the loss of his friend, Romeo kills Tybalt and flies to Friar Lawrence's hermitage. We'll take a closer look at this a little later. After hearing Benvolio's account of the event, Prince Aeschylus reproves both families. He fines them. He says it's going to hurt. The fines are going to be painful. And he banishes Romeo from Verona. The nurse then apprises Juliet of the situation and offers to facilitate her spending one night with Romeo before he goes into exile. Meanwhile, the friar informs Romeo of the prince's judgment and attempts to reconcile him to the situation. The nurse arrives to fetch Romeo to take him to Juliet, and the friar encourages him to go and spend the night with her and then flee to Mantua until their marriage is disclosed and peace and order restored. Ignorant of Juliet's relationship with Romeo, her father accelerates his plan to marry her to Count Paris in just 3 days. After spending their final night together, Romeo departs for Mantua. Juliet uses Tybalt's death as cover for her grief over their separation. And then Lady Capulet informs Juliet of her betrothal to Paris, which Juliet, of course, vehemently protests, which enrages both her parents. And she's further stunned when the nurse, her longtime confidant and advisor, urges her to move on from Romeo and marry Paris. Act 4, which is in 4 scenes. This is the English actress Ellen Terry playing Juliet. See, she's got the vial with the mysterious sleeping potion that she's about to drink here. We'll look at the speech that she's delivering at that moment later in the video. So Paris consults with Friar Lawrence about his impending nuptials, but is interrupted by Juliet, who's come to the hermitage looking for a way to get out of the situation. After Paris leaves, Juliet threatens to kill herself, but the friar devises a risky plan that will allow her to reunite with Romeo. And what it is, he's going to prepare this potent drug that mimics the effects of death. After drinking it, he explains, she will fall unconscious, and then upon discovery, determined to be dead, she will be promptly interred in the Capulet family tomb. Romeo will be apprised of the plan by letter. Remember, he's now in Mantua, and instructed to enter the tomb at the moment of Juliet's revival. And liberated then from their respective families, they can slip away to Mantua together, leaving Verona behind forever. Juliet assents to this proposal and returns home, where preparations for the wedding are already well underway. She dissembles compliance with her father's wishes, and then shortly after consumes the potion. She's later discovered by the nurse, who announces that she's dead, and the whole household is plunged into despair. And so finally, Act 5, which is in 3 scenes. This is the obviously this is in the Capulet tomb. This is the production with Julia Marlowe and her future husband, E.H. Southern there. So Friar Lawrence has entrusted another monk named Friar John with a letter addressed to Romeo in Mantua detailing the elaborate ruse that will reunite him with Juliet. But an outbreak of plague has placed Friar John in quarantine, and the letter is never delivered. Friar Lawrence decides to bring Juliet back to his hermitage and conceal her there until a new plan can be developed. Meanwhile, however, Romeo's servant Balthazar informs him that Juliet is dead. Romeo purchases a lethal dose of poison from an apothecary and returns to Verona, where he intends to kill himself inside Juliet's tomb. But by the time he arrives at the cemetery, Paris is already there, grieving the loss of Juliet. Paris recognizes Romeo as Tybalt's murderer and threatens to apprehend him and see him executed. So they fight, and Paris is slain. This is the second man killed by Romeo. Afterwards, he enters the tomb, he gazes upon Juliet for the last time, and then poisons himself. Friar Lawrence arrives just as Juliet awakens, but he leaves her behind as Prince Escalus and other city officials descend on the cemetery. They've been notified that trouble is there. Alone, surrounded by the corpses of her spurned fiance Paris, her murdered kinsman Tybalt, and now her true love and husband Romeo, Juliet sucks the residue of poison from Romeo's lips and stabs herself to death. Friar Lawrence and Balthazar are apprehended and explain the sequence of horrible events that resulted in all this carnage. And the prince once more admonishes the two families, who finally reconcile and pledge to erect expensive monuments honoring their lost children. And that is how the play concludes. So first we're going to look at Act 1, Scene 1, lines 158 to 33. This is Romeo's first appearance in the play. It's not particularly winsome. He's dour. He mopes listlessly. I have lost myself, he tells Benvolio. I am not here. This is not Romeo. He's some otherwhere. He complains of his unrequited love for a girl named Rosaline, whom we never meet. And he does so using all the shop-worn conventions of Petrarchan love poetry. There are the archery metaphors, the allusions to Cupid and Diana, the paradoxical language of Petrarchan love. Here, for example, he says, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep, that is not what it is. This love feel I, that feel no love in this. So there are distinct echoes throughout here of the great sonnet sequences of Shakespeare's contemporaries, particularly Sidney's Astrophel and Stella. But there are echoes of his own poetry as well, Venus and Adonis, which has been published a couple years before this, before he wrote this play, and the sonnets to the fair youth, some of which were likely written around this time, the mid-1590s, though they were not published until 1609. So, for example, Benvolio asks, she, that is Rosaline, hath sworn that she will live chaste? And Romeo says she hath, and in that sparing make huge waste. For beauty starved with her severity cuts beauty off from all posterity. It's a sentiment that Shakespeare frequently expresses in his sonnets to the fair youth. Act 1, Scene 4, lines 153 to 221. This is a scene I've talked about just a little bit ago. Romeo's first encounter with Juliet at the masquerade. Again, like I said earlier, it's a scene that actually contains an English sonnet. It's embedded in the dialogue between Romeo and Juliet. So it's a shared sonnet. And Shakespeare had experimented with this as well. Or would experiment with it in Love's Labour's Lost. This moment is Romeo's first sight of Juliet, but while he's blazoning her superlative beauty here, he says, it seems she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, and so on. Danger is already brewing, as Tybalt, who's also at this party, he's a Capulet, recognizes Romeo's Montague voice and has to be restrained from attacking him by his uncle Capulet. The sonnet here actually begins at line 204 in the Norton. It starts, if I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine. And then in the ensuing dialogue between Romeo and Juliet, they go back and forth elaborating on this conceit or elaborate analogy between physical intimacy and religious devotion, with Romeo casting himself as the pilgrim and Juliet as the saint to whom he offers prayers, which are, of course, prayers for physical rather than spiritual blessings. Very, very famous scene. Not as famous as this one. Act 2, Scene 1, lines 44 to 227. This is the very famous balcony scene, one of the most iconic scenes in all of Shakespeare. That and perhaps the graveyard scene in Hamlet. with Hamlet holding Yarick's skull. I'm not going to say too much about the scene here. I will occasionally draw passages from it later in this video. There are so many good ones. Romeo and Juliet here, they discuss the heavy freight of language, the power and weight of words, the impediment of a family name. That takes up a lot of their initial conversation. The dilemma of being in love despite the ties and loyalties of kinship, of discovering their desires to be in conflict with the institutions that define who they are, the institutions that structure their lives and shape their destinies. And this scene clearly establishes their willingness to challenge those linguistic structures. Juliet says, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." But she also seeks assurances here of Romeo's sincerity and commitment. After all, she hardly knows this man. Even she remarks at one point how fast they're moving and tries to pump the brakes a little bit. She addresses him as the god of my idolatry. How strong is that? And asks him to swear to his fidelity, which he then starts to do, but then she abruptly changes her mind, interrupting him. "Well," she says, "do not swear. Although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning, which doth cease to be ere one can say it lightens." On the other hand, she doesn't want to move too slowly either. She says, "This bud of love by summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when next we meet." And they ultimately agree that this flowering should take place the next night. So from spring to summer in 24 hours time, although Romeo complains that it feels like 20 years. So we'll come back and look at some more passages from this scene a little later. But this idea of time, of the compression of time, the speed of time is a theme in the play. We'll talk about here in several different scenes I've listed out here. Act 1, Scene 3, lines 11 through 64. And then Scene 4 of Act 1. Act 1, Scene 4, lines 128 to 152. This is Capulet at the masquerade. And then Act 3, Scene 5. This is Romeo and Juliet's last night together, lines 1 through 59. And I wasn't sure how to describe all of these scenes together here, so I just call it Wormwood, Corns, and Larks. So the older characters, Capulet, Juliet's nurse, Friar Lawrence, they are all conscious of how quickly time swallows up life. One of my favorite scenes with the nurse is where she fondly remembers when Juliet was a toddler, how she weaned her off breast milk by soaking her nipples in wormwood, how when Juliet was learning to walk, she fell and got a bump on her head. And she remembers these events as though they happened only yesterday. Her reminiscence is really strong. She actually repeats it twice. And yet in the time since then, she's lost her own daughter. She's lost her husband. She's lost most of her teeth. And her awareness of this, of how fast time seems to go, this gives her this practical turn of mind, which will later prompt her somewhat surprising and quite insensitive advice to the distraught Juliet to give up on Romeo, who's been banished from Verona, and to go ahead and marry Paris as her parents wish. Time is wasting, she seems to say. Juliet's father, too, Capulet, is conscious of time's effects on the body, joking during the masquerade that women who avoid dancing are concealing the corns that pinch their feet, and that he himself is past his dancing days. A kinsman who's there with him reminds him that it's been 30 years since their last masque, and this surprises Capulet. It surprises him that it's been so long. And he just kind of marvels at how time flies. When memories are the measure of time, it seems that time passes quickly. We mark the past with memorable experiences, and then the gaps between those experiences just kind of fall into a void, and so a vast expanse of years can collapse into what seems like hardly any time at all. I think of it as being kind of like a globe maker, as John Donne might say, who must reduce the entire surface of the planet to only its essential features that can be drawn onto strips of paper and pasted onto a sphere that fits in the palm of a hand. It's different, though, for young lovers. They do not dwell in the past. They do not look backward at what once was. They live in the present entirely and revel in the immediacy of flesh and blood. Time accelerates when they're together because there's never enough of it. There's never enough time to contain all their youthful desire. Juliet's comical pinballing back and forth to the window in Act 2, Scene 1, her denial of the lark's song in Act 3, Scene 5 attest to that. And in both these scenes, the nurse is Time's insistent messenger. Your lady mother is coming to your chamber. The day is broke. Be wary. Look about, she says, in Romeo and Juliet's last scene together. Their last scene while both are still alive, that is. But when they're separated from each other, time slackens and drags. The minutes seem days. The hours seem years. Time cannot keep pace with their urgent desire to be together. The anticipation of future fulfillment always seems to draw out to interminable length the empty present. And it seems an entire lifetime's worth of love and pleasure shall become the waste of just a few hours. This sense of time's agonizing compression often paints Romeo and Juliet's expressions of love in morbid colors. I'll give you an illustration of this from Romeo's departure at the end of Act 3, Scene 5. He says, "Farewell, farewell, one kiss, and I'll descend." And then Juliet replies, "I must hear from thee every day in the hour, for in a minute there are many days. Oh, by this count, I shall be much in years ere I again behold my Romeo. Think'st thou we shall ever meet again?" And Romeo says, "I doubt it not. And all these woes shall serve for sweet discourses in our times to come." And Juliet says, "O God, I have an ill-divining soul. Methinks I see thee now thou art so low." He's descending down the rope ladder to flee through the Capulet's garden. "Now thou art so low," she says, "as one dead in the bottom of a tomb. Either my eyesight fails, or thou lookest pale." Romeo says, "And trust me, love, in my eye so do you. Dry sorrow drinks our blood. Adieu, adieu." Okay. So next is Act 3, Scene 1, lines 53 to 195. This is a turning point. Many critics have observed that early on, Romeo and Juliet could be played as a romantic comedy, like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. But here, in the first scene of Act 3, we've reached a point of no return. It seems that, like, from this point forward, everything's going to turn out badly. Tybalt here murders Mercutio in the street. Tybalt's impulsivity may not be surprising, given what we've seen of him earlier. Everyone, including Juliet herself, knows that Tybalt is out for Romeo's blood. But Romeo's sudden and reckless violence, which culminates finally in Tybalt's death, has troubled many readers. This is the same man who, in earlier scenes, kept aloof from the affairs of family and friends, who preferred nocturnal solitude, and initially balked at attending the Capulets' masquerade because of ominous premonitions, suddenly he now appears impetuous and savage. He says, "Away to heaven, respective lenity, and fire and fury be my conduct now." So rather than waiting for Prince Aeschylus to decide Tybalt's fate, rather than reminding himself of his commitment to Juliet a few hours earlier, he chooses a course of action here that ultimately will destroy them both. So, pivotal scene. Act 3, Scene 2, this immediately follows it, lines 1 to 137, and then a sort of a connected scene. The next scene, Scene 3, lines 17 to 71. Both of these largely involve reactions to Romeo's banishment from Verona. So in the earlier of the two scenes, Act 3, Scene 2, the nurse delivers the news that Romeo has slain Tybalt and he's been banished from Verona. And Juliet's initial response, interestingly, is to fall back on family loyalty. And there's some really fine poetry in her fierce castigation of Romeo here. She says, "O serpent heart hid with a flowering face, did ever dragon keep so fair a cave? O nature, what hadst thou to do in hell when thou didst bower the spirit of a fiend in mortal paradise of such sweet flesh?" This mood, however, does not last long. After the nurse casts judgment on Romeo, shame come to Romeo, she says, Juliet suddenly shifts from dutiful daughter to loyal wife and comes to Romeo's defense. She says that his banishment is insufferable. The dismal prospect that they never again will be together is a sentence, she says, even worse than death, and not just Romeo's death, but everyone's. She says, Romeo is banished. To speak that word is father, mother, Tybalt, Romeo, Juliet, all slain, all dead. There is no end, no limit, measure, bound in that word's death. No words can that woe sound. In the later scene, in Scene 3, Romeo echoes this in his speech to Friar Lawrence, who's completely exasperated with Romeo at this point. He says, "Banished is banished from the world, and world's exile is death. Then banished is death mistermed. Calling death banished, thou cutt'st my head off with a golden axe, and smilest upon the stroke that murders me." His speech continues, and it takes a particularly morbid turn when he elaborates on the idea that even the lowliest and foulest creatures may still benefit from Juliet's physical presence. He says, heaven is here. What he means is heaven is in Verona. Heaven is here where Juliet lives, and every cat and dog and little mouse, every unworthy thing live here in heaven and may look on her, but Romeo may not. More validity, more honorable state, more courtship lives in carrion flies than Romeo. They may seize on the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand and steal immortal blessing from her lips. This may flies do, when I from this must fly. And sayest thou yet that exile is not death? So the irony here is that this imagined heaven with blowflies alighting on Juliet's flesh as though she were some kind of immaculate corpse foreshadows the final scene in the Capulet tomb, where Romeo, now suicidal, gazing upon Juliet's pristine body, because he's convinced, along with most everyone else, that she's dead, fantasizes himself lying in death, forever pressed against the bosom of her corpse, with worms that are thy chambermaids, he says. In no other play by Shakespeare is death so frequently and so insistently eroticized. Shall I believe, he says, before imbibing the poison, that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the lean, abhorred monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? After discovering Juliet's body, believing her to be dead, even her father remarks, there she lies, flower as she was, deflowered by him. Death is my son-in-law, death is my heir. My daughter he hath wedded. I will die and leave him all, life, living, all is deaths. The word death, someone observed once, appears more often in Romeo and Juliet than any other Shakespeare play. So we're going to talk now about the proposed marriage of Juliet and Paris. In the first scene here, Act 1, Scene 3, lines 66 to 101, Juliet's mother and the nurse encourage her to consider Paris's eligibility as a potential husband. Clearly, they favor him. And they're applying pretty strong pressure, more pressure even than her father, who just moments earlier told Paris that she was still too young to marry. Lady Capulet has this elaborate conceit about Paris being a book, and that if Juliet reads him and approves the contents, she should bind herself to him and make herself into a beautiful book cover. It's disturbing, I know, reducing her daughter to an ornament. But what really seems most noteworthy in this exchange to me is Juliet's docility and her filial deference. She says, "I'll look to like, if looking liking move, but no more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly." But whatever sense that she has here of duty, of family loyalty, it's all gone by the end of Act 3, which is the second scene I have listed up here, Scene 5, lines 68 to 26. In this dialogue, first between Juliet and her mother, and then with her father, and then finally with the nurse, we see her, I think, in her strongest light. She's cleverly disguising her grief over Romeo's exile as rage over her cousin Tybalt's murder. And everything she says in this interaction with her mother has double meaning. So Juliet, speaking to her mother here, says, "No man like he, that is like Romeo, doth grieve my heart." And Lady Capulet responds, "Well, that's because the traitor murderer lives." She says, "Aye, madam, from the reach of these my hands. Oh, how my heart abhors to hear him named, and cannot come to him, to wreak the love I bore my cousin upon his body that hath slaughtered him." So what her mother hears as her daughter's vengeful hatred toward Romeo, we know as the audience to be expressions of her love and sexual desire. The best example, and the funniest, is when Juliet's mother finally informs her that she is to marry Paris, and Juliet, of course, vehemently rejects the idea, and she says this, "I will not marry yet, and when I do, I swear it shall be Romeo, whom you know I hate, rather than Paris." In Act 1, we saw Juliet's father in a somewhat different light, urging Paris to be patient, to give Juliet a year or two to mature, and stressing the importance that she should be wooed and develop reciprocal feelings for him. And by the end of the third act, his attitude is completely reversed. No waiting, no wooing, no weighing of his daughter's readiness or willingness. And maybe it's the heavy fines that Prince Aeschylus has imposed on both families for the death of Mercutio. Maybe he said they would be devastating. Maybe this has incentivized Capulet's decision to marry her off a little more expeditiously. Whatever the reason, he comes across now as being more like Hermia's father Aegeus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, commanding her to marry Paris or be banished from his house. Her mother sides with her father, but the nurse's practical advice, encouraging her to marry Paris, this is lines 214 to 226, it's the most surprising and painful for Juliet. The nurse says, "I think you are happy in this second match, for it excels your first, or if it did not, your first is dead, or 'twere as good he were as living here, and you no use of him." And this, of course, leads her to Friar Lawrence, who comes up with a plan to reunite her with Romeo. And then we get this speech right before she drinks his sleeping potion. Act 4, Scene 3, lines 13 to 58. Shakespeare is very adept, especially in the tragedies, at using the soliloquy to create suspense, to prolong and problematize complex decision making. Here, it is Juliet questioning the friar's motives and imagining the horrors that await her when she finally awakens from her death-like sleep. It's quite a dilemma she faces. She's going to drink this stuff. She doesn't know what it is. And when she wakes up, she's going to be buried alive, waiting on others to deliver her from the tomb. Both Romeo and Juliet evince a disturbing attraction to the macabre for reasons that I briefly touched on earlier. 200 years after Shakespeare, the poet John Keats, dying of tuberculosis, wrote, "I have been half in love with easeful death." And that seems true of these two young lovers as well, as we've already seen in some of their earlier speeches. But this speech in particular is astonishing for the vividness and extremity of its morbidity, with images of fetid, unbreathable air and putrid flesh and wailing ghosts, culminating finally with the melodramatic vision of Juliet bludgeoning herself to death with the bones of her ancestors. A more cynical reader than I am might almost laugh at this stuff, and I imagine this speech is really challenging in performance to deliver it and make it compelling. Act 4, Scene 3, lines 123 to 165. This is the musician scene. It's an unusual moment in the play, one that's easy to dismiss, especially in print. The entire household believes Juliet has died. We've just witnessed successive outpourings of heart-wrenching grief. And after the family exits, the servant, Peter, the nurse's servant, Peter, he comes and trades insults with the wedding musicians, who decide they're going to stick around, not, it would seem, because they share in the Capulets' grief, but rather for the opportunity of a decent meal. Food originally ordered for the wedding feast, but that now will feed Juliet's funeral procession. It's a good example of a really good illustration of the way Shakespeare modulates the emotional experience of his audience, so as not to overwhelm us with pathos. He inserts the scene of witty exchange and grim irony. A scene similar to it, one we're going to encounter soon, is the scene with the gravediggers in Hamlet. Has quite a similar effect. Finally, we're going to look at the death scenes. How can we not? Act 5, Scene 3. Romeo's lines 74 to 120, Juliet's 147 to 170. Romeo's death speech, it contains some wonderful poetry, doesn't it? Here will I remain with worms that are thy chambermaids, he says. Oh, here will I set up my everlasting rest and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Good stuff. Juliet's speech, not so long, nor so intentionally or intensely lyrical. She describes what she sees, and she announces what she does. The contrast with Romeo's highly rhetorical speech is striking. In her death scene, the pathos is more physical than verbal. I think it would be conveyed to the theater audience through expression and through gesture rather than through the spoken word. You can compare her relatively brisk, straightforward final lines, "Oh, happy dagger, there is thy sheath," and she's stabbing herself. "There rust and let me die." You can compare that to some of Romeo's more ponderous, elaborately conceited lines. "Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark." This metaphor of the ship, incidentally, is a clever ironic reprisal of the patricianized courtship language that Romeo had used earlier in the balcony scene when Juliet asks, "By whose direction foundst thou out this place?" And he says, "By love that first did prompt me to inquire. He lent me counsel, and I lent him eyes. I am no pilot, yet wert thou as far as that vast shore washed with the farthest sea, I should adventure for such merchandise." Another important difference in Juliet's death scene is that she's not alone. Friar Lawrence is with her at first in the tomb when she awakens, and he advises her urgently to let him escort her out of the cemetery before they're discovered and all their clandestine actions, which he has orchestrated himself, are exposed. He proposes hiding her away in a monastery, presumably for the rest of her life. She rejects this proposal. And the haste with which Lawrence leaves her behind, realizing, I think, what she's likely to do without his intervention, is really troubling. Looking back at Romeo and Juliet's first encounter in Act 1, Scene 4, with its beautiful analogy of religious devotion and physical intimacy, it is noteworthy that neither in Romeo's death oration nor in Juliet's frantic final moments does either one of them imagine the consolation of a happy reunion in the afterlife. They often compare each other's beauty to heavenly bodies, but they never imagine themselves joined together there. In the balcony scene, Romeo says of Juliet's beautiful eyes, "Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their sphere till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eye in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night." And then later, in their final scene, love scene together, Juliet says this. She says, "Come, gentle knight, come, loving black-browed knight, give me my Romeo, and when I shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." So for these star-crossed lovers, beauty may be immortalized, it may be enshrined in the heavens, but love is physical, it's sensorial, it can only really be experienced in the flesh on this side of the grave. Juliet says to Romeo at the end of the balcony scene, "'Tis almost morning. I would have thee gone, and yet no farther than a wanton's bird that lets it hop a little from his hand, like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves, and with a silken thread plucks it back again, so loving jealous of his liberty." And Romeo says, "I would I were thy bird." And she says, "Sweet, so would I, yet I should kill thee with much cherishing." And ultimately, they do die of much cherishing. Long before they reach this point, they imagine death as a kind of comfort, a release from the trammels and the trammels and divisions of family, of language, a release from time's oppression and the pain of separation. Nowhere do they imagine their love immortalized as writ in the stars. That it just would never satisfy. Just as their grieving parents' mutual commitment at the end of the play to raise these cold memorial statues in precious metal seems a futile gesture. To be mingled together in dust is the consummation most devoutly wished. And with that note, I'll end the presentation on Romeo and Juliet.